Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another episode of Utterly Pointless Comparisons for you. It's been a while, and today I'll be looking at the arcade and Saturn versions of Mortal Kombat II. The Saturn version is notorious for a few reasons, but does it deserve that notoriety? Spoiler alert, yeah, it kinda does. You'll get to see a complete side-by-side playthrough as usual of the arcade and Saturn versions, but for the Saturn version, I'll show you a combo between FPGA sometimes, via Mr. Pi, and software emulation via Beetle Saturn at other times, so you can see if there's a big difference between FPGAs and software emulation for this game. Here's a look at the hardware specs for each system while I tell you just a little smidge about the game. Mortal Kombat II hit the arcades in November of 1993, and was huge. You know this game. I've covered it a lot over the years, so I'm not gonna ramble any more about it here. MK2 wasn't released for the Saturn until March 1996 here in the US. Europe got this one first by about a month, and Japan got it within one day of the US release. This one was developed by Probe Software and published by Acclaim. Probe and Acclaim. What a team! If you don't know this version, I bet right now you think the Saturn version is probably perfect. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
I'll go over all the gory details, and I'm not talking about this game's blood during the commentary. The Saturn version is based on the MS-DOS version of the game. I'll throw that out there now, so nobody complains I didn't mention it later. I bought this version right when it came out, by the way, so I've had this since day one. Now, recording methodology? The usual, I played the games through. I made sure to do a nice variety of fatalities this time, since you guys fairly complained about me just blowing everybody up last time. You'll see all the stage fatalities and both standard fatalities for Katana this time. I didn't do babalities or friendships, and I did use save states here and there for the arcade one. Remember, I'm not claiming to be awesome at the games I'm showing you, I just want to show them to you. For the Saturn side, like I already mentioned, I recorded two playthroughs, one on FPGA and one on a traditional software emulator, in this case Beetle Saturn via RetroArch. The FPGA doesn't have save states, so I had to just play that one through, while for Beetle Saturn, I did employ a gentle use of save states here and there, just to try and get things close to the arcade version. I'll label on the screen what you're looking at all times, so you know whether you're looking at the FPGA version or the software emulation version. I'll also do some things full screen on this one for a few seconds from time to time because, well, some of it you just have to see full screen to really appreciate. I also removed some of the load times from the Saturn version to keep these things in sync, so you won't see the 8 or so seconds it takes to load between each fight, not each round, each fight. I'll show you a sample of what the load times were like during the conclusion of the video. Also, folks, I suggest sitting through this entire video and not jumping around. There's interesting stuff all throughout this one, all the way up through the end. So grab some food, grab a drink before you start, sit back and relax. Now then, let's get on with it. Now I'm going to pause here briefly to point out the character select screen. At first glance, you might think these are about identical, but they sure aren't. There's a noticeable color reduction in the Saturn version. Look at Scorpion and Johnny Cage especially. On the Saturn, they're actually using some dithering there, while in the arcade the color gradients are much smoother and more subtle. We can see it with Liu Kang, Shang Tsung, Jax, and almost everyone else too. And if we look at Katana in both versions, we can see she's more pixelated with worse color gradients on the Saturn as well. Now it still looks good on the Saturn. The point of this video is to look at the differences, and there are plenty. I mean, look at Melina's face in the arcade versus Saturn on the character select screen. I'll be quiet for a moment here so you can hear the pretty big difference between the arcade song that it plays during the mountain versus the Saturn version. Now I'm not going to do a bunch of these pauses, but one more here at the start and then I'll go back to uninterrupted gameplay until something wacky needs to be pointed out. So look at the backgrounds and characters here. You can definitely see they're a little chunkier on Saturn and lose some detail. That's due to the lower resolution. I can't really explain on Saturn why it often uses fewer and different colors. The Saturn can technically have over 32,000 colors per sprite depending on how they're handled. We also see some differences in color in the background with darker colors in the Saturn version, especially behind the grates and right under the bridge. In the Saturn version, there are also fewer ripples on the surface of the acid up by the walls. You'll also notice that most of the chains are thinner, and the concrete that juts out just under the rectangular grates is smaller. For the Saturn, I'm starting out with this game on Mr. Pi FPGA, running the Mr. Saturn core. I'll play a little chime each time I switch, and you'll see it listed on the screen at all times. So let's start with two of the biggest things here, and one that I've already touched on a bit. The arcade version's refresh rate is about 55 Hz. I'm showing this to you as close to perfect as I can. The video is recorded and plays back at 60 frames per second, but I actually played the game at 55 on a variable refresh rate monitor and set the arcade version to a 55Hz refresh rate manually in RetroArch. If you've played this on emulators and thought that it was a little too fast, or on some emulators you noticed that the voices weren't quite deep enough, it's probably because you were playing it at 60 Hz. As for the Saturn version, well, it runs at the normal NTSC 60 Hz, which is the version we had here in the US. Okay, on the Saturn side, I'm switching to Beetle Saturn for the second fight. For the Katana vs. Katana fight here, we see alternate color Katana has very different colors from the arcade game for some reason. There are some color differences between Saturn emulation and the FPGA core that you'll see in this video, but those can be tweaked on both platforms, so don't worry about those. As for the stage, the yin-yang in the middle of the arena is a little bit smaller on Saturn. On Saturn, the red sky background is quite a bit different from the arcade version. It's darker, it goes to black lower on the screen vertically, and then goes back to red above that. One thing you can't see on the screen that I'll talk about briefly is the horrible input lag in the Saturn version. And again, this is a real hardware thing, so you'll notice this even when playing the game on FPGA. There's an obvious delay when moving your characters left and right. Now this delay doesn't seem to affect special moves too much, but stuff that is instant in the arcade and even Genesis and SNES versions noticeably lags on the Saturn, and it's mind-boggling that this was allowed to happen. Oh, and for this third stage fight here, the Saturn version plays the wrong stage song. The third and fourth stage songs are reversed in the Saturn version for some reason. Otherwise, this stage is pretty close between both versions of the game. There's not a huge difference like there have been in some of the prior versions of Mortal Kombat 2 I've looked at. When we do get up to the fatality here, I'm going to show you each version of the game full screen individually because there's a lot of stuff here worth talking about. I'm going to get some of that talking done now so you can listen to the fatality. There's a lot of noise and music stings. There's 3 separate ones used during a fatality in the arcade game, along with the normal screams and other stuff. On the Saturn version, fatalities are eerily silent. You'll hear almost nothing. They get rid of all of the music stings, including the one that plays just for a moment before you do a fatality. When we get up to that one, just bear in mind, I didn't edit this. This is what it sounds like on real hardware. Also point out here that lots of the sounds and voices are missing from the Saturn version. The announcer doesn't say the round number at the beginning of rounds, and he doesn't say the name of the character who won. I'm guessing Probe had some trouble cramming more stuff into round. For this next background, the wizard guy in the back is a smidge smaller on Saturn and floats way higher up on the screen. On the audio side of things, sort of like I already mentioned in the last fight, this one plays the wrong song here. The third and fourth stage music is reversed in this Saturn version. Oh, and a quick note about loading times here. The loading times between fights in the Saturn version, not rounds, but fights, is about 8 to 9 seconds on average. The round transitions are fast, but those load times between fights, they're not terrible, but they are noticeable. They're not nearly as bad as some other games in the genre, but you will be sitting around twiddling your proverbial thumbs for a while. The resolution difference is really pronounced. The arcade game runs at 400 by 254, while the Saturn version is 320 by 224, the same as the Genesis/Mega Drive version of the game. This resolution difference between the two formats meant that Probe couldn't just grab the arcade artwork and stick it in the Saturn version. They had to either redraw or at least tweak everything for that version. Alright, so here we are in the forest, and there are a few things we can discuss here. The first is, the furthest background layer is much lower on the screen in the Saturn version of MK2 than the arcade original. Also, the faces on the trees. These are Ed Boon's face, of course, but the faces have more obvious seams in the Saturn version. The third layer of trees in the arcade is very thin with very small faces, but the trees on the third layer on the Saturn are wider with wider faces. While we wait for me to finally beat old Liu Kang here, let's switch over to FPGA on the Saturn side with Mr. Pi. You'll see once again in this case that the differences are minor between emulation and the FPGA implementation. And remember, those color differences can be tweaked. Anyway, this game is one instance where switching over to FPGA doesn't really help with the controls because of the input delay inherent in the code. Anyway, we'll swap back to Beetle Saturn for the rest of this stage, and then I'll switch sound to the Saturn and shut my app for a minute so you can enjoy its mostly silent fatality.
Fatality.
The armory here looks pretty good on Saturn, but it's definitely not perfect. Both the floor and wall have lost a fair amount of detail, but this was one of those stages that was close enough most people probably would have been able to spot the differences without the games being shown side by side. Now the biggest giveaway that the Saturn version isn't quite as good here is with its weapons racks and their contained weapons. The weapons are a bit of a pixely mess in the Saturn version, and the base of the column lost a lot of detail. As for Baraka, you can tell he's lost a fair bit of detail himself, especially on the hand furthest away from us during his normal walking animation. In the arcade version, it looks like a hand. On the Saturn, it just kind of looks like an amorphous blob. But I'm curious, tell me folks, if I haven't pointed this one out, would you have even noticed? Now you probably already noticed some hitching or pausing in the Saturn version of the game. That's not an FPGA or emulation problem, it does that on real Saturn hardware. Pretty much when you do any special move for the first time in a session, or sometimes even just in a fight, the game pauses for a split second to load it. What gives mid-1990s probe? The game also often pauses during fatalities. And we'll listen to the sound again just for a moment here.
Wins. Fatality.
For the Pit 2 here, the Saturn background is a lot darker than the arcade one, and the same is true of the Saturn foreground. The cloud layers are also positioned much differently. They move the upper two cloud layers much lower vertically in the Saturn version, and they also lowered the moon way down on the screen from, I would say, the upper third to the middle third. The bridge in the background is also considerably less detailed, as are the two little guys fighting in the background. And no, that's not Liu Kang. Look it up, you'll be surprised. Now, one interesting thing I'll point out during this fight with Sub-Zero in particular is that his ground ice move works differently in the arcade and Saturn versions. If you hit him while he's firing off ground ice in the arcade version, it vanishes instantly. On the Saturn, if you hit him after he starts the move, the ground ice finishes executing and stays on the ground. That's a pretty big thing to get wrong gameplay-wise. Now let's check out some music again for a moment.
Finish him.
Alright, now here's the stage fatality for both versions. It looks pretty good on Saturn until you hit the floor. The floor is way more pixelated than the arcade original. This time it is extremely noticeable, but at least it's got nice smooth scaling. Another thing to point out here is the victory text and the word fatality are higher up on the screen in the Saturn version. The portal is probably the most accurate stage in the Saturn version of the game, but still isn't quite perfect. The dithering is a lot more pronounced, but there's enough color used at a high enough resolution that it doesn't look as bad as, say, the SNES or Genesis titles. The floating priest guys are a bit more pixely on the Saturn, and those hills and mountaintops in the background at the bottom of the screen, you can make out exactly what they are in the arcade version, while on the Saturn they kind of eliminated almost all the detail and pretty much just made them outlines. And again, this still looks great on Saturn. I'm just pointing out the differences that are definitely there that people may not have noticed. Speaking of which, in the arcade version, when you knock someone down, the entire screen shakes. In the Saturn version, on some stages like this one, only the ground shakes while the background stays stable. Weird, don't know why it's like that.
Fatality.
Here we are in Khan's Arena, which is probably the worst of the main backgrounds in the Saturn version. It's the most compromised. It's lost the most detail. The audience here is just a mess of dots on Saturn. Now, the audience wasn't super detailed in the arcade, but they were identifiable as people, at least, in a crowd. Also, the crowd only has 2 animation frames on Saturn versus 3 in the arcade version, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but it's a pretty big difference in motion. And hey, that's 50% more animation, technically. Also, the throne is up a little higher for some reason on Saturn. It's probably the resolution differences to get more detail out of the ground. And that second section of the ground behind Shao Kahn and the prisoners in the arcade version is so small on Saturn that it's practically non-existent. Shao Kahn himself is a lot blockier and less detailed on the Saturn. This background just looks like it was squished down a bit too much on Saturn. Anyway, as we fight Reptile here, you'll notice that he loses a lot of detail in the pattern on his suit, which is true of all the other ninja characters too, but I don't know if it's just the coloring, but I feel it stands out more on him than either Sub-Zero or Scorpion. Alright, let's do the up-close fatality thing for each version. The sound differences here will be extremely pronounced.
Wins. Fatality. Fatality.
Again, much more silent on Saturn. Aside from missing the things we discussed earlier, for this fatality it's also missing the blood splash sound effect. Alright, here we are back in the Deadpool. I showed this to you on Mr. Pie last time, so we'll do Beetle Saturn this time. Alright, there's not a ton going on during this Johnny Cage fight, so let's just talk some general stuff again. Now overall, I want to say that I think Probe, visually at least, did a really good job on this version. I'm pointing out all of these differences here. A lot of them are pretty minor and nitpicky. A lot of them have been pretty significant. But being nitpicky is the entire point of showing these differences. We just want to see how and what changed. And the fact that we have to be pretty nitpicky means that Probe actually did a pretty good job visually. Having said that, the floor texture looks worse on the Saturn version here. I didn't have time to point that out the first time around. And aside from that, if you look at Johnny Cage's body in particular, you can see just how pixelated it looks compared to the arcade version. You can rewind this to the beginning of the match and pause it to where they're both standing in the same pose. I don't want to make this video any longer for people. Flashing lights warning, guys. If you're bothered by flashing lights, then skip ahead to at least 16 minutes and 47 seconds. That'll get you past them, and you'll be fine for the rest of the video until we beat Shao Kahn. Now, we only have to beat Scorpion one time here to unlock access to Jade, which I do in both versions because, well, you've just got to see what they've done to Jade on Saturn. Here, as we earn the right to fight Jade, you'll see the text is super squished in the Saturn version. They probably left the arcade font completely intact, thus forcing them to squeeze it onto a smaller, lower-res screen, meaning the tracking or horizontal space between the letters is worse. It's all smushed together. This is true of most of the text throughout the game. Again, I view this one as pretty lazy. Probe could have either made a new font that was smaller, or at least spread this one's characters out a little bit more. And now something weird. In the arcade version, the game has lots of fading. It fades from the mountain screen to the stage screen for each fight. On Saturn, it doesn't do that, it just cuts to black. However, on the intro to the Jade fight, the Saturn version has a gradual fade, while the arcade version does a jump cut. Strange. Speaking of strange, here's Goro's lair and Jade. What the f*** is going on with Jade's skin color in the Saturn version? She went from noticeably dark-skinned to even lighter skinned than Katana. Goro's lair looks a little bit off in both versions of the game compared to Mortal Kombat 1. They did a good job of replicating the arcade look on the Saturn version for this stage. I think this is one of the more faithful arenas in the Saturn game. The one big difference here is Probe sloppily left a seam visible at the top of the first layer of stonework at the bottom of the screen on the floor. We also get completely different music in the arcade and Saturn versions. After we beat Jade, for some reason, we're back on the character select screen, which happens in both versions. Alright, so here we are back in Kahn's arena for the weirdest fight of the Saturn version. Look at the characters on Saturn. They're even lower resolution and more pixely in this fight than the others. Why is that? Most likely to save memory for Shang Tsung's morphs. My guess is they shrunk the characters down a bunch and then just zoomed in to get them full size. When you're on a CD-ROM based system, if you don't want loading during a portion of the game, you've got to store everything you need in RAM, and storing the animation for every character would have required way more RAM than the Saturn had. Compromises were made, but there were also options. And these are controlled by the options menu at the start of the game. Now you can leave morphing on, so Shang Tsung can become all characters. You can set it so he can only become the opponent, or you can turn off morphing altogether. Now I did my first playthrough here with morphing on to all characters, and yeah, it's a pixely mess. But if you look at the game with either of the other two options, the sprites look basically back to normal again. So if you ever thought the sprites looked extra chunky in this fight on Saturn, well, good news, you were right, they are. Oh, and those pauses when Shang Tsung morphs do occur on real hardware also. It's interesting the way they handled it, but really not ideal. They could have decided to leave it so Shang Tsung can only morph into the opponent, and then one other character, but instead of including all the other characters' animation, just frames for the moves they're going to use during the fight. And they could purposely restrict those moves to reduce the animation frames required. Anyway, just spitballing here. Aside from that tidbit, the rest of this fight is unremarkable. This is also the last fatality we get to perform in the game.
Finish him. Katana wins. Fatality.
Here's Kentaro, and yeah, he's big on Saturn, and he seems to have the vast majority of his animation frames here. One thing I'll mention now that was tough to squeeze in earlier is that when you do Katana's fan lift move in the Saturn version of the game, it actually pushes the enemies away further from her a little faster, making it tougher to follow with a jump kick and air fan combo, and it's really tough to add the flying punch thing she does at the end if you want to get another hit in. Another difference here is the audience cheers and is loud in the arcade version. There is no audience sound at all on Saturn, and overall, I've found it way easier to deal with Kentaro in the arcade version than the Saturn version of the game. When playing on FPGA, he actually beat me a few times. The horror! I was worried I was going to run out of credits before the end. But nope, I made it, but not without tossing many a curse word at the game. So I guess at this point I've got some time to talk a little bit more about the moves and the controls and how important it is to get things like the timing and spacing and all that correct when you're porting a game from the arcade to a home system. Any little timing changes can really throw off the entire feel of the game. In the case of Mortal Kombat II for the Saturn here, the delay when you're moving characters left and right has a huge effect, even though it seems like a little thing. Likewise, the stuff I talked about with Sub-Zero and his ground ice and Katana with her fan push not working exactly the same, they have a major effect even though there's seemingly very small differences. You don't have to be a genius to know when something doesn't quite feel right in a game. That, even more than the missing sound effects and missing music, is probably the thing that hurts this game the most and contributes most to its reputation. Alright, now we're up to Shao Kahn himself. For this fight, once again, it's tougher on Saturn, mainly because of the way the fan lift range and movement were modified. Also, Shao Kahn's voice is awfully out of sync at the beginning on the Saturn version, and many of his possible lines from the arcade version at the start of a match seem to have been cut. At least there were some I didn't hear after playing through this game about 6 times on the Saturn for this video. Shao Kahn, like everyone else, is a little more pixelated on Saturn, and it's kind of funny that what are clearly leg muscles in the arcade become sort of just dark dots on the Saturn version. Hey Shao Kahn, you might want to go to the doctor and get those checked out. Now the real big change here, we won't see until after the fight. Anyway, as we go defeat Shao Kahn and get ready for the ending, first, here's your flashing light warning on that again. Skip to 22:27 to get past them. But anyway, the arcade ending does all the normal stuff and cycles through many backgrounds very quickly before Shao Kahn explodes. Probe was like, nah, we're not gonna do that. We'll just have Kahn explode and call it a day. Now they could have recreated the ending via video, which wouldn't have looked as crisp and clear as gameplay, but at least they would have been able to keep the entire ending intact. But nah, they went a different way. After taking down Kahn, who's kind of a pushover in the arcade and isn't that much harder on Saturn, we get to see that ending I've been talking so much about. And like I discussed just a minute ago, these things are drastically different. Check them out. Now for the ending text again, it's smushed together on the Saturn because of resolution differences. Also, the bottom text is the wrong color compared to the arcade version. Oddly enough, the energy bars are gone in the arcade for this part, but they left them there on the Saturn version. Also, I'm going to trim a tiny little bit of the Saturn ending because it lingers longer on certain parts than the arcade version does. Now as for the pictures in the end, we can see they look pretty good on Saturn. But again, not quite as good as the arcade version. A fun, no one cares kind of difference is the text is aligned the same in both versions until you get to the part about grotesque clone created, where probe moved created down a line, altering the rest of the text spacing from that point on. What's kind of funny, on the second picture and text screen for Katana's ending here, is that some of the text on the Saturn version runs past the edge of the text box. Now I can't give Probe too much grief for that one, because even in the arcade version, Midway did that in a few places themselves. Once again, the picture quality is a little worse on the Saturn, but it's still not bad. Now I'm going to do another minor bit of editing magic here. The arcade version shows the cast of the game, or who play the actual characters, while the Saturn version eliminates that part and goes straight to the programming credits. However, after the standard programming credits on Saturn, they go on to show pictures of many of the staff that worked on the game. I guess they felt it was more important to include them than the actual cast of the actors in the game, huh? Now I'm moving that part to the middle here to better align these endings. Just keep in mind, when you're playing this for real on Saturn, it comes last. Oh yeah, because of the copyright demons, I can't play the ending music with nothing on top of it. Just be aware that the Saturn version, for part of it, cuts the ending music out entirely. So while the ending plays here, I'll give you some quick thoughts before the video wraps up. Saturn Mortal Kombat II gets a lot of flack. And sure, it deserves most of it. It's not unplayable though. In fact, it's far from the worst Mortal Kombat port we'd get. If you love MK2, then I think you'll still enjoy checking out the Saturn version despite its flaws and foibles. It offers some pretty unique differences and head-scratching decisions. I'm not doing a formal review of it here, but if I had been reviewing this at the time it came out, I think it would have deserved no less than a 6. I might have even gone as high as a 7. We expected better. Probe should have done better. This game could have used another month or two in development to correct its issues. It's not like there should have been any rush to get it out. It was years after Mortal Kombat II hit the arcades. If they could have reduced the control lag in walking, fixed the missing music and sound effects, and correct some of the gameplay differences, like Sub-Zero's floor ice and Katana's fan pushing opponents too far too fast, this could have easily been a 9, and the unquestionable best home version of the game. But what can I say, folks? We got's what we gots. And that's a decent, but flawed version of Mortal Kombat 2. Please stick around for a very concise conclusion. So there we are. That's the arcade and Saturn versions of Mortal Kombat 2 compared. It's really a shame that the Saturn version came out the way that it did. The machine was a 2D powerhouse, and its version of MK2 was just a bit poorly put together. The sound problems, low resolution, the even lower resolution of characters while fighting Shang Tsung with morphing to all characters on, the butchered ending that removes the cast of characters, and more lead to a version that was a letdown upon release. There's also some slowdown in this game if you hadn't noticed that. In particular, it happens in the Living Forest and Khan's Arena during the boss fights. By 1996, we should have had better, and in fact, just a couple of months later, we would get better. A still imperfect but much better version of Saturn Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. But that's a story for another time. Saturn MK2 is an okay port of a great game. It's not Mortal Kombat Advance on GBA, which completely earns its reputation. Saturn MK2 is frustrated because they were so close to making it great and dropped the ball in some very obvious ways that could have been easily avoided. It really should have been great. Alrighty folks, what did you think? Had you seen Saturn Mortal Kombat 2 before? Have you played it yourself? Did you spend your hard-earned money on it or beg for it as a gift back when it was new? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. It's the only way my little channel here can grow. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through super thanks or channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.